Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. As always, I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we are joined on our season finale of this season of the podcast with a very special guest, Green Party of Ontario leader Mike Schreiner. Not only is he the Green Party leader of Ontario, but he's also, which I should point out is a position that he's held since 2009, but he's also the member of provincial parliament for the riding of Guelph, which is a position that he's held since winning the election for that seat in 2018. Prior to politics, a community activist, a leader, and a successful small business owner. And now he's 6 or so months away from defending that seat in re-election and looking to further grow the Green Party in Ontario. So MPP Schreiner, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, Mitch, my pleasure to be on and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so I want to be respectful of time. So to do that, let's get right into it. I mean, I think in this podcast, we always like to talk about policy issues in depth, but we also like to talk about politics and sort of where they intersect. And there's no shortage of issues, as we're only a few months away. We've got lots to talk about, whether it's COVID recovery, housing, climate change, transportation's been a big one lately in Ontario political circles, and then of course the politics of it. So perhaps let's just start chipping away at that list. And the first thing on it was COVID-19. I mean, this is obviously something that you didn't envision having to deal with when you won the election in 2018 and became the first representative of the Green Party in Ontario's legislature. So knowing, just like you, I'm very curious, knowing like you that the government has had to adapt to this in real time. It's an evolving issue and an evolving situation. Just generally speaking, what do you make of the government's response to COVID so far?
Yeah, Mitch, first of all, I'd like to just say that this week we reached a pretty grim milestone in Ontario. 10,000 Ontarians have lost their life because of COVID, and just want to offer my condolences. My heart goes out to family, friends, colleagues, loved ones of those we've lost. I would say in the early days of the pandemic, I felt Ontario in general and government in particular responded in a positive way. In the early days, I was a part of a number of all-party briefings, all-party efforts to quickly pass legislation to support people and businesses. I think as the lone Green MPP, I played a key role, I think, in expanding the definition of people who could take time off for work, expanding the definition of why they could take it off and who they could care for with government, really kind of brokered the conversation around fast tracking the commercial evictions ban, did a strong advocacy for community gardens because I know how much growing local food benefits particularly the most vulnerable in our communities. And I would in general say that there was a lot of unity at Queen's Park and across the province. That started to break down during the summer of 2020. I think the premier prematurely kind of did a campaign style stops throughout the province at a time when people like myself were saying, hey, we need to be ramping up staffing in long-term care and in our hospital sector, particularly PSWs and nurses. We need to be making investments in our schools, lowering class sizes, improving ventilation, et cetera. And the government was slow to respond, or to this day still hasn't even responded to some of those efforts that I think could have mitigated, particularly the second wave of the pandemic. And then for me, a lot of it started to really break down when the government in November 2020 introduced a 3-color coded plan that had all the public health experts saying, whoa, this is like going to be disastrous if we implement this. And they did walk it back about 10 days, 14 days later. But by then, the second wave was really taking off, and tragically really taking off in our long-term care homes. And then I felt like we could have gotten on top of it over the holidays that year. But I'll never forget February 11th, 2021, when the co-chair of the Science Advisory Table said, hey, if the government prematurely opens up, we're headed towards a disaster. And the government prematurely opened up, and that's exactly what the third wave became and hit us the hardest. And so I felt like the government could have responded and should have responded better if they had done a better job of listening to the science, following the metrics and the data, and following the advice of public health experts, which is something I've been consistently calling for throughout the pandemic. And so I think Ontario's response could have and should have been better prior to the second and third waves.
Would you say, related to the variants and sort of the fourth wave, and if you want to call it that, in Ontario, would you say the government sort of learned a bit of a lesson from the first few?
I think the government, I think going into the third wave and their response to the third wave forced them to learn a lesson. I mean, I'll never forget the disastrous press conference, on a Friday where it was like, hey, we're going to bring back carding and police checks, and we're going to ban your kids going to playgrounds. And I've never seen such a unified pushback to any government announcement ever. I mean, you even had police associations saying, hey, we're not going to enforce
Mhm.
this. I immediately came out opposed to it. And so I think the government has learned their lesson from some of those types of actions and have been a bit more cautious with the fourth wave. But at the same time, it's still really disappointing that we still haven't seen aggressive action in reducing class sizes, for example. I can't tell you how many teachers I've met with. There's more than 30 students oftentimes packed in classrooms. And it shouldn't surprise us right now that if you look at most of where COVID cases are being driven are in schools right now. And part of that's because, as children under 12, the vaccine has just now been approved for them.
Mhm.
But I think some of that's being driven by the fact that the government could have and should have been more aggressive with public health measures in our schools, better utilization of rapid testing, better PPE, like mandatory higher quality grade PPE, rolling out ventilation renovations quicker, requiring mandatory vaccinations for teachers. I think there are steps the government could have taken, but the good news is the fourth wave certainly hasn't been as bad as the third wave.
Mhm. And well, I think there's a few things to unpack there. So first, I should mention for listeners specifically, this is being recorded on November 30th, and lots happened in a few days. I know that we're dealing with a potential new variant that may change things. So still to be determined, but worth putting that sort of note out there. But you use the word cautious, and I think that that's kind of the right word to describe Ontario right now in terms of the government's response and certainly its efforts to reopen. Of course, the one thing that's changed from wave 4 compared to 3, 2, or even 1 is the fact that there are vaccines in this province now, and at quite a high uptake rate for those, especially for young adults and adults and the elderly. So we're now kind of approaching, hopefully and optimistically, and I'd knock on wood if it was near me, but we're approaching the reopening of the economy. It's certainly more open than it's been at any point in the last 2 years during the pandemic. And I want to sort of shift the conversation away from just the government and more towards some of your particular stances and your party stances right now, because I find there's no shortage of substance when it comes to the Green Party, which is a good thing. And included in that, you've got some pretty big housing and environmental plans that would really, they would cost a pretty penny, but they would do a lot of things as well. I want to talk just about that economic cost quickly. We can get into the plans, and we will get into the plans. Rising inflation, fragile economy. These plans will cost money. They will take more money out of the economy. Are you worried about increasing the cost of living in order to achieve those things you want to achieve on housing, transit, and climate change?
Absolutely not. I would say one of the largest drivers of inflation right now is housing costs. And the biggest affordability concerns that most people have is finding an affordable place to call home. And so our plan, which aggressively looks at how we engage the private sector and the public sector in increasing housing supply and ensuring that we increase the amount of housing affordability supply. And I know we can get into the details of the plan, but that's going to help address major cost of living concerns for people. The other big driver of cost for folks is what people are seeing at the gas pumps. And it just shows you how vulnerable we are as Ontarians to the volatility in international oil and gas markets in particular, which is why I want to get big oil ahead of our lives and electrify transportation as fast as possible. It costs me right now 1/10 the cost to operate my electric vehicle as somebody who operates a comparable internal combustion vehicle. Expanding electrified transportation options for people so they don't have the high carrying cost of a personal automobile. Maybe you can have one instead of two. Those are real concrete ways we can help people save money, make life more affordable for them. And then the final one is food costs are being driven up for people, which is one of the reasons I've been such a strong supporter of strengthening our local food supply chains. As you probably know, my business background is, starting a couple of local food companies and starting nonprofits that promote local food and farmers. And Greens for many years have been talking about the importance of strengthening our local food supply chain to help mitigate global changes in the cost of food as well. And the final thing I'll say is that Ontarians ship about $24 billion out of our province to purchase energy from other jurisdictions, primarily oil and gas. If we electrify our transportation systems and our building heating systems, that $24 billion can stay in Ontario, creating Ontario jobs, building Ontario businesses, strengthening Ontario's economy, and at the end of the day, helping people save money on their energy costs.
Yeah, so there's a few different threads we could go down there, but the first thing I'll just say quickly as an aside is, as someone who's written a couple of provincial platforms, and I'll say has the dubious distinction of writing two for the same election, hearing how you're going to pay for things and having them properly costed out is music to my ears. I don't know if I would like to think the general public is interested in that, but at the least, politicos like myself are. So appreciate you giving a sense of where those cents will come from. So perhaps let's go down the housing rabbit hole. You mentioned that first off as your in your answer there. So it's a pretty significant plan. And for those who haven't seen it, you can find it on the Green Party website, and there's been lots of media coverage of it. But one of the key aspects of that plan is actually using the government itself to build 100,000 affordable units. We saw, just the other day, I think the NDP leader came out and suggested that accelerating municipal permits and the speed of municipal permitting and housing was perhaps a ploy to get developers' pockets filled. And the government is saying, no, this is about building housing. You're here saying, I know you want to use the private sector in some capacity, but you're also saying 100,000 units on the government to build. Why the government instead of the private sector, and why is that the right way forwards?
Well, first of all, Mitch, our plan does engage the private sector pretty significantly. And so hopefully I'll have an opportunity to answer a question about how we can utilize the private sector as well. On the public sector side of things, 93% of the affordable housing in Ontario was primarily built in the 1970s and 80s, a bit in the 60s and 90s, and primarily government support of nonprofit and co-op housing providers. And both the federal and provincial governments got out of the housing game in the mid 90s, and very little deeply affordable, below market rate housing has been built since. So it's almost all old housing stock at this point. And so for me, the evidence and just the historical facts are that if we're going to address the housing crisis, government has to get back into the game, has to partner with nonprofits and co-ops to build deeply affordable housing. And we have a plan of how we would pay for it. I believe in being really honest with people. And so what we're saying is the government spends over $6 billion a year directly subsidizing electricity prices. We're the only jurisdiction in North America that does that. A disproportionate amount of that benefit flows to high income earners. So we're saying that why are we subsidizing electricity consumption for upper middle class and wealthy individuals when so many people in Ontario can't even afford to have a place to call home? Let's reprioritize that money. Let's build 100,000 affordable housing spaces over the next decade. On top of that, 60,000 permanent supportive housing spaces with wraparound mental health and addiction supports to address chronic homelessness. And the studies have shown that when you spend $10 of public money in housing affordability, you save $22 in other costs to government, primarily in criminal justice and healthcare costs. And I can tell you, you talk to any, police chief, hospital CEO, head of the local emergency services, and they'll tell you that a disproportionate burden being placed on frontline first responders and our healthcare system are people who are facing housing instability, oftentimes have other issues they're dealing with, perhaps mental health and addictions issues, poverty, other social determinants of health. And that is putting huge pressure on our healthcare system, driving costs into our healthcare system. And we're saying, hey, let's start to solve that by addressing the housing crisis, which is going to improve quality of life for people, improve communities, and at the same time, help us save money in other areas.
So you're giving me all sorts of different questions to go down. I mean, we've got stuff about electricity policy, social determinants of health, and there's lots of stuff I want to get in there. But you asked for an opportunity to explain the private sector side of the housing plan. I want to give you that. So one of the things that I noticed in the plan, and I got to be honest with you, as a policy person, I've written about this, and we've done some work with the Ontario Real Estate Association, frankly, about as of right zoning, and I mean they call it removing exclusionary zoning. You could kind of play around with the different terms that you want. But essentially this idea that denser forms of housing in residential neighborhoods should be allowed without lengthy municipal approval processes. And one thing that I noticed about that, which is included in your plan, is not only is it included in your plan, but it's fairly broad. I mean, you've actually gone so far as to say in every residential neighborhood in the province. Why is that the right tool? You can maybe explain how that is utilizing the private sector, but why is that the right tool across the board for the whole of Ontario?
Well, part of the reason is we have to rapidly increase housing supply, and we have to do it in a way that we don't pave over the farmland that feeds us and contributes $50 billion to our economy. We don't pave over the wetlands that clean our drinking water and protect us from flooding. And we've already lost 75% of our wetlands in Southern Ontario. So, we have to get past what I see as a false choice between tall and sprawl. There's lots of room in the middle. And one of those middle solutions is to enable people to, turn single family homes into duplexes, triplexes, add secondary suites, laneway housing, build things like tiny homes, co-housing, so we can have gentle density, be able to increase supply within our existing urban boundaries. And so that increases the supply of both attainable home ownership spaces for people, as well as rental spaces, which takes pressure off our rental markets. And it also creates another potential revenue stream for existing homeowners to be able to afford a mortgage, to have additional income from another rental property, and or to be able to cover costs better, to have a triplex instead of a large single family home. I should be clear with people who want to say, oh, well, you're going to get rid of all single family homes. No, this isn't saying get rid of all single family homes. What it's saying is in areas where you have exclusionary zoning that only single family homes are allowed, you create other options for people, and you don't force people and or developers to go through a lengthy approval process to build gentle density housing, so we can ramp up supply faster and create more home options and choices for people. Because I think so many people out there want more options. And right now, the current marketplace, partly because of exclusionary zoning rules, are restricting the kinds of options and choices people have in terms of their housing options.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so. I'll say a couple of things. I think one is, you mentioned honest a few times, and I would like to say that that's a reputation that you've built in the short time that you've been at Queen's Park and before. I know that a lot of people sort of respect the candidness and the forthrightness about some of these ideas. And one of those areas where, sort of to tie housing and the honesty together, there's this opposition tendency to say, no, I'll always do the opposite of government. And on municipal zoning orders, you weren't as unequivocal as saying, no, I'm never going to use this tool. You reserve the right to use it. And so I want to follow this path a little bit here, where what you're kind of saying is, let's fix the zoning process so we don't have to use municipal zoning orders very often. But kind of in order to get there, we have to do one big municipal override in order to do that. So it's a bit of having cake and eating it too. How do you marry that respect for municipalities, that you're obviously sort of the end goal that you want to be at, with the idea that you may have to tell them what to do for a little while in order to get there?
Yeah, I think through the provincial policy statement and the growth plan, the province has a role to play in setting the rules of the game, setting some of the parameters, and in some cases, being more directional than maybe every municipality wants. That being said, within those parameters, still providing municipalities with the ability to, make decisions that are appropriate for those municipalities, and still providing, opportunities to say, hey, we want to have high density here and not over here. And so I don't think we need provincial interference in that regard. When it comes to ministerial zoning orders, to me, the problem with the current government has been the misuse and abuse of ministerial zoning orders, and in particular, some of the extraordinary actions they've taken to override, especially environmental protections, but also heritage protections. So I think of, the ministerial zoning order for the Amazon warehouse and the Duffins Creek wetland, the glass plant in Stratford, the foundry buildings in Toronto. To me, that's where the government overstepped. I think ministerial zoning orders should be rarely used, but I think it's a tool that is appropriate to use in some cases. And, two examples I oftentimes use is, the previous Liberal government used one to build a grocery store in Elliott Lake after the mall collapsed, so people could have access to a grocery store. But it was done in a way that complied with both provincial and local planning rules and just facilitated and fast-tracked them. Same way with the ministerial zoning order to stop the St. Mary's Quarry in Flamborough, which would have blasted a hole through into the Niagara Escarpment and threatened local drinking water supplies. I think that was an important use of a ministerial zoning order to protect the community's access to clean drinking water. So I don't want to throw ministerial zoning orders out, but I do want to improve the planning process. And I also think we can learn from communities such as Minneapolis. I oftentimes use as an example that is reform the way in which they do community engagement, casting a broader net where the community engagement process for development applications and planning approvals isn't just with existing residents, but includes residents who want to move into the neighborhood to give them a voice as well, to help communities get to yes, and to figure out ways that communities can get to yes on development approvals and gentle density in a way that still engages people in the planning process.
Yeah. So I mean, I promised off the top that we were going to get into the policy. I think we've done that so far, but I mentioned a few different other things. So I want to make sure that we leave time for it, because I think it's a great answer on municipal zoning orders, and really, shows that you've done some of the work on this to come up with the position and advocate for it. So one of the other major planks that you put forward is the environmental plan. I think when most people think Green Party, they think environment. There's a reason for that. And so, I want to ask you a couple of quick questions about that plan, because included in it is, advocacy for a carbon price, one where we currently have one in Ontario, although it's implemented by the federal government. We don't have it endorsed by the provincial government. In the last election, maybe this transitions over a bit to the political side, but in the last election, support of a carbon price was something that Premier Ford, then leader of the PC party and not Premier, used to hit his opponents in the debate, in social media graphics throughout the election. Not only are you advocating for a price on carbon, you want one that's more aggressive than the current price, going to $300 per ton by 2032 compared to the current plan, which will go to $170 a ton by 2030. I think we understand the importance of it. Are you worried about politically that being a bit too far? Or do you think Ontarians are ready for this?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you look at the last two federal elections in Ontario that have happened since the last provincial election, Ontarians overwhelmingly voted for parties that support carbon pricing. And I think our plan that returns all the money collected from individuals and households are returned back to individuals and households through a carbon dividend. All the money collected from businesses are returned back to businesses through programs that will help businesses become more energy efficient, reduce their energy costs, and lower their carbon footprint. We think's a winner. And I think one of the reasons I think I'd like to see the province take it over is, one, I'd like to be actually sending rebate checks to voters, because while voters get the rebate back through their taxes, I think most people don't even realize that. But I think if we have rebate checks, much like the McGuinty government did with HST rebate checks, remember the days when people were protesting in front of Queen's Park against the HST? The minute they got their HST rebate check, it was like, oh, I guess we're not so upset anymore. I think people are going to feel the same way about carbon pricing as well. And the bottom line is Nobel Prize winning economists, business leaders, pretty much everyone who, has a, deeper understanding of how the economy works knows that the lowest cost, most economically efficient way of crushing climate pollution is through carbon pricing. And so we believe it's a market mechanism that will be effective. And we think Ontarians have already said that they are supportive of carbon pricing, given their votes in the last two federal elections.
Yeah, I think the point about the checks is a very good one. I certainly remember the long lineups at gas stations the day before the HST came in, and it seemed to blow over pretty quickly. So obviously that can change as the dollar amount goes up. But the point about getting recognition for the work that Ontarians are putting in through their through mitigating their own carbon emissions, or just frankly through paying the extra fees to do so, is sort of worth recognizing in some capacity. So a fair point there. But we'd be remiss to suggest that the plan you've put forward on climate change and on the environment is just a carbon tax, right? There's a lot more to it. It's got, I think, in total about $65 billion of additional spending over a period of time. You've sourced where that's going to come from, both from the increased carbon tax, but also from parking levies, road tolls, all sorts of things like that. And I really, I want to hammer in and focus in on a bit about a line you used, talking about the government that has focused in on drivers and doing more for those who drive to work and commute to work and so on. And you said Ontario needs a green recovery, not a gray one. And I thought that was a pretty clever political line, and it sort of juxtaposes your position well. But it does bring me to this idea of, I'm curious about the Green Party's positioning on building new infrastructure net, because you're kind of saying to drivers, hey, it's going to be more expensive. Are you supporting new infrastructure if it's tolled, if it accounts for that cost of potential pollution? What's the sort of position on new builds on roads and highways more generally, not just the 413 project, which I think we could obviously talk about in this as well?
Yeah, so first of all, our road pricing mechanisms are primarily congestion charges, and that can be done in a very dynamic way and primarily focused on mitigating congestion going into places like Toronto. In terms of when it comes to new highway construction, we're opposed to additional 400 series highways, primarily because we now have 100 years of history in North America that shows that every time you build more highways, you just increase more demand for those highways, and you have about a year or two of relief from congestion, and then they just fill up with again. And so from a fiscal responsibility standpoint, we have to look at solutions that are actually going to address congestion. And so that's why we're very aggressive in expanding electrified public transportation. We certainly support subway and LRT projects that are already in the pipeline, and we'll certainly work hard to complete them. But we also support a rapid expansion of electrified bus and dedicated bus lanes, because we know that's the fastest, most inexpensive way to help people have other transportation options outside of their car. And that can be ramped up very quickly, significantly reduce driving costs, commute times, and climate pollution at the same time. Also, our plans around building livable, affordable communities factors into this as well. I mean, essentially the highway plan that the current government's put out, primarily with the 413 in the Holland Marsh Highway or Bradford Bypass, is really going to consign people to longer commutes, because it's essentially saying Ontario is going to continue to sprawl, and people are going to have to continue to drive longer distances to be able to find an affordable place to call home. And so that's why our housing strategy is so connected to our climate strategy, because we're saying, hey, we're going to find you an affordable place to call home, close to where you work, you shop, you play, you worship, to support the local businesses in your community. So we really see that as an economic strategy to support small businesses, to support local economic growth, and to help people reduce their commute times and increase their productivity at work.
So one of the things you mentioned in there, transit, I think we're at actually a place of somewhat unanimity and of thought within the major parties, which is new, frankly, for Ontario about building this transit. We've also started to reach that unanimity of thought when it comes to electric vehicles. And I think this is a really new development for the province. And we can talk about the reasons why for that. But what I'm more interested in, because obviously a position that you've held and your party's held for some time about this being the future of personal transportation. It seems that under Premier Ford, the Conservatives are sort of choosing the side of subsidizing the producer, right? They're going out and trying to get new plants and become the economic engine and so on of building electric vehicles here. Under Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca, they've come out and said they're going to bring back the credit for those who lease or buy vehicles. So they're sort of going the route of subsidizing the consumer versus producer. Do you have a dog in this fight, or you support both sides of that?
Our plan supports both sides of that. And as a matter of fact, we have to get really aggressive in attracting capital investment in the auto sector in electric vehicles. And in order to do that, not only we need to provide incentives for businesses to invest here, but we also have to show those businesses that we're going to build a consumer market to buy those vehicles, which is exactly why we need to do both. You know, the thing that really distresses me right now is just in the last year or so, $24 billion of capital investment by auto manufacturers just in the southern US alone. The states of Tennessee and Kentucky, 11.5 billion in those two states alone. So Ontario is lagging behind in terms of attracting investment in auto manufacturing when it comes to electric vehicles. So, you know, I'm disappointed that the Ford government is so late to the game, and they spent the first 3 years of their mandate essentially saying to electric vehicle manufacturers, hey, don't come to Ontario. We're going to rip out charging stations. We're going to get rid of rebates and what have you. And so, you know, I'm happy that they finally recognized the error of their ways and are starting to address that. But it's really put Ontario in a very tough position because a lot of capital investment has already gone in to the electric vehicle sector. And so we have a lot of catching up to do, which is why I think we need to be aggressive on both the manufacturing side of things, as well as building a consumer market.
Yeah, and I think that'll be, you know, an interesting take throughout the debate that is likely to continue on transportation and electric vehicles, which, you know, I didn't necessarily have at the top of my list of the issues that we'd be talking about in the 2022 election, but so far it seems to be one of them. So pivoting to that election a little bit, because you know, we have a few minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we cover off the political side of things. You know, you've mentioned a few different times on this episode, be it, you know, your position on the Fair Hydro plan and removing those subsidies for higher income individuals. You mentioned some of the transparency about, you know, life is going to be more expensive for drivers, but you'll get the rebate. Like, these are some, you know, I define them as sort of bold positions, right? They're honest and forthright, but they're also politically difficult sells at times. You know, I'm curious, as, you know, being a new party to the legislature and a growing party, you know, does that positioning where you know the government benches might be out of reach this time around, but there's still room for serious growth, does that allow you to be a little bit more sort of politically risky and put forward those policies that you think Ontarians might be clamoring for?
Well, I mean, first of all, I got into politics to essentially to be honest with people, to operate with integrity, and to really push good public policy. And so my feeling has always been, if you can't, you know, lead with honesty, integrity, and good policy, then why am I even here doing this job? And I think people in Guelph really appreciated that approach and that framing. And that's how I earned their trust and ultimately earned their vote. And, you know, we'll decide that the good folks in Guelph will decide in the next 7-8 months whether I get the job back or not. And folks in other ridings are going to decide whether we have additional Greens. Like, I'm really excited to have Diane Sachs, a former environment commissioner, one of the top international lawyers, running for us. Matt Richter and Parry Sound Muskoka, which is now an open seat. He received over 20% in the last election, I think poised to break through in this election. We have a number of strong candidates, particularly in the Guelph, Wellington, Waterloo region. So a little bit of beachhead growing out of Guelph, attracting strong candidates. So, you know, my goal is to, you know, hopefully be reelected in Guelph and come back to Queen's Park with a caucus of more than one, because I know how much influence we've had with just one seat at Queen's Park. I think most people, you know, if you talk to most folks, they'd say we've had an outsized influence, and that's primarily due to the amazing team I have around me to support the work I do. And just our members and supporters have been fantastic in supporting the work I do. But we can even have more influence with additional seats. And who knows, we might have a minority government. I look at how effective the BC Greens were when it was a minority government in British Columbia. And I would like to hope that we could have that same influence here at Queen's Park after the next election. But ultimately, the voters are going to make that decision.
It's worth pointing out. I worked in opposition for 4.5 years, depending on how you count the days, which feel longer sometimes. But it's worth pointing out that the way that funding works for your parliamentary resources is completely tied to your seat count. Just because you're a party that gets in doesn't mean that you get extra. You get it completely determined about party status, which is I think 12 right now in the legislature or something like that, and then you also get it based on the number of seats you hold. So you're expected to answer the questions on every single policy issue and every single bill and legislation that's on the floor. But you have the same amount of resources as an independent MPP. It doesn't sort of extrapolate upwards despite that. So how have you found the ability to manage that demand on time? And the caucus meetings may be a little bit easier, but it seems like that's a really heavy workload. How do you balance that leadership of the party, the MPP responsibilities in Guelph? I'm just curious what that day is like for you.
Yeah, well, first of all, I work long, hard days, but I love to work, so I'm not complaining in any way. And you know what? I approach this in many respects same way I approach running businesses and nonprofit organizations. I delegate a lot of authority to my staff, and I think because of that, I have an incredibly dedicated, high-performing, high-functioning staff that punches well above our weight. Sometimes I think, oh my gosh, what could I do with the millions that the NDP caucus has because they have official party status that we don't have? Like, we operate on crumbs compared to them. But I feel like we're still, we're engaged in every debate in this legislature on every single issue, and I wouldn't be able to do that without an amazing team around me. And I can tell you on the constituency side, I made it really clear to my staff that my primary job is the MPP for Guelph. It is to serve the people of Guelph, be the voice of the people for Guelph. My role as party leader comes after that. And so, I really have been clear with my team in the constituency office that, high quality customer service is a top priority. We call people back, we write them back, we go to bat for them. That's a high priority for me. And then when I'm in the legislature, making sure that I'm reflecting Guelph's voice. My first private members bill came after me, actually doing surveys in the community and saying, what's the most important issue you want me to bring up at Queen's Park as my first private members bill? And protecting water was like overwhelmingly people came back with. So that's what I chose. So really trying to be the voice of people in Guelph. I do a lot of consulting with, a whole variety of members of our community to make sure I reflect the community's voice here. And then ultimately, I tell people, then the third job is to being party leader and making sure that I'm a strong voice for those hundreds of thousands of Green voters across the province who don't have a Green MPP and look to me to be their Green MPP and making sure I'm speaking out on those issues. I mean, the good news is that, those are the kinds of issues I campaigned on. And so the people of Guelph voted for me to speak out on those issues. So it makes it a little bit easier because I think, the values I represent and that I bring to the legislature are very aligned with the values of the people who live in my community.
Yeah, I think it's honestly a bit of a refreshing answer. I think a lot of politicians say, that they're there to represent the interests of the community, and obviously they are. I mean, I worked at Queen's Park for a number of years. There's a lot of good people on benches of all sides, but hearing you put the scale, the priority and balance is a refreshing one. So just one more question before I let you go. You mentioned some of the areas where the Green Party could potentially break through or has, some pretty strong support. Parry Sound Muskoka. I think the federal party broke through in Kitchener-Waterloo area this time around. I'm curious, you likely, I don't know if it's been confirmed yet, but I would hope so, and likely that you're going to be included in the debates this time around. You've got a growing presence. Obviously, retaining your seat in Guelph is high on the priority list, but both from a political perspective of returning potentially more members, but also from a policy perspective of getting other parties that may hold a balance of power or you holding a balance of power to implement some of the ideas. What's a successful election result of 2022 for the Green Party and for you?
Yeah, I think, success for us is obviously, re-election in Guelph, expanding our caucus. And, I'm going to be realistic. We're not going to form government. We're likely not going to form the official opposition. It would be a stretch to even get official party status. But increasing our caucus is really important, and then increasing our vote share across the province. Because the one thing I've learned over the years is that you can have a tremendous amount of influence, sometimes without even winning a seat, just by your vote share and pushing the other parties to talk more about the issues that your voters are concerned about. And it's an opportunity for those voters to have a voice. And so, that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping to be in the leaders debate, because I think that's a potential game changer for us. Like, at no time in the history of the Ontario Greens have the people of Ontario had an opportunity to see the leader of the Ontario Greens on the big stage in the one, depending on how many leaders debates, 1-2 moments where almost the vast majority of people are tuned in and are listening to what the party's values, vision, policies are, and to be able to have that opportunity for the first time, and for the people of Ontario to really get a deeper understanding of what the Green Party is all about, is a huge opportunity for us. And I'm hoping that if we're afforded that opportunity, we can seize it and make the most of it.
So I know I said last question, but I got to follow up on that really quickly. So, you mentioned getting a deeper understanding where the Green Party stands on its policy positions. It probably not a surprise that a lot of people would still associate Green with a single issue, which is environment and climate change. Do you think that reputation is changing? I can imagine your time as MPP over this term has certainly helped, but is that really a breakthrough that you want to get for the party as well, is to show off more about housing and transportation, these other things that may be green, but also are not just green?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we have a very strong economic policy. I mean, the fact that the Conservatives are finally waking up and realizing, attracting investment in electric vehicles should be a high priority for Ontario. And if we'd been doing that 3-4 years ago, we wouldn't be so far behind other jurisdictions in that regard. Our support for small businesses, our innovative approaches around supporting healthcare. I've been a strong advocate throughout, especially the pandemic, supporting frontline healthcare workers. Our plans around education, mental health, our housing strategy. But the one thing I will say is that we can't deny the fact that climate affects everything. The World Health Organization has said, outside of the current pandemic, climate change is the biggest threat to health, people's health. We saw that with the heat wave this summer in BC. We've seen it with the tragic loss of lives, with the mudslides and flooding in British Columbia right now. Healthcare directly affects our infrastructure and just our ability to maintain the vibrancy and vitality of our communities. The fact that $26 trillion of global capital investment is going into green technology and green businesses shows what an important role that climate action plays in strengthening our economy and creating new business and career opportunities and better paying jobs for people. So climate in many respects affects all aspects of our society. So yes, the Greens have strong positions in all the various policy areas that concern people's everyday lives. At the same time, we also have to recognize that climate change directly affects each and every aspect of our life, and we need to make the kinds of investments to improve people's quality of life by addressing the climate crisis and adapting to it as well.
Yeah, it's a real foundational lens by which to make decisions, right? And I think that's come across well in this episode. So, in addition to a lot of the other policies and positions you put forward, so I want to thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it. We've talked about how busy you are, and you spent 45 minutes with us or so. So really appreciate this. Best of luck in the near future, and we'll hope to have you back on again, and we can reevaluate and see exactly how the party did in the 2022 election. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corps. All rights to this episode are reserved. and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.